Welcome everybody. To belt or not to belt? That is the question. Actually, you're tuning in talking about should we always train with a belt or should we never train with a belt? Spoiler alert, we're probably going to tell you you should most always be training with a belt. First, we're going to talk about all the different belts. Maybe not all of them, because there's a lot of different belt options out there. And then we're going to get into what common myths and actually how to use a belt. That'll to tie into some of our other stuff, breathing, bracing, and possibly even when to look at maybe when or why we would suggest to not lift with a belt. That being said, let's jump into belt options. So many people have seen a belt like this before. Might be something at, a cheap sporting goods store. You'll find with the discount weights over there in the corner, and it's fine for what it is if we understand what we're getting out of all belts. The next one we'll come across is very similar to, you'll see something like this or something a little softer like this strongman apparatus that we have here. Flexible belts definitely have their purpose. As you can see here in weightlifting, CrossFitters may want to have two belts, something more rigid and something a little more flexible, because the demands of the sport. I can tell you from practice, when I used to do a lot of CrossFit and weightlifting, one day I thought I would get more rigidity, we're going to talk about rigidity, out of belts by wearing my powerlifting belt. So I strapped it on and I went to do some cleans and snatches. It worked pretty well until in the bottom of a clean I got folded over because the belt wasn't giving like this one is here. My ribs rolled right over the top of a 13 millimeter powerlifting belt. I cracked a rib and it did not feel pleasant. If I would have stayed with my softer, more flexible belt, I may not have got as much rigidity out of my spine for the pull, the receiving position, and standing up in the squat if I would have maintained position. But I lost it, folded me over the belt, and I wish I would have had something that gave a little bit with me. Now we'll look at some other common belts. You'll see these very typically with our bodybuilding community. You can see here on our next slide what that actually looks like. So where we get concerned, as you'll know or you'll hear later on in our discussion, where we want to pressurize and where we want rigidity at. Thinking about anatomy here, if you're looking at me like a skeleton, most of this is going to be pretty soft and pliable. Why? Because we don't have bones, ribs, and spine material there. The rest of my rib cage, right, is going to be pretty stiff. We will talk about one sticky spot where it's hard for a lot of people to pressurize and help their intra-abdominal pressure or learn to use their belt better, and it's in this small quadrant back here by your QLs. It can be a very tricky spot, but we'll get there. Part of our concern is with a belt like that, imagine all of this material behind me in my low back, but then around in the front where we just said we know there's less rigidity because of ribs, and all we have is this cute little thing up front to pressurize into. Not a bad thing. Again, if we know what we're using it for, that might allow for us to get into some machines or some different bodybuilding type movements without as much impingement on the front side. Now we get into strongman. This is very unique, as you'll see, actually wearing two belts here. This amazingly strong athlete is belted up twice. In the gym, sure, you could do that for powerlifting, for bodybuilding, strongman for sure, but in powerlifting competitions, we're not going to be able to do so. If we look at what the belt material is underneath there, something similar to this. Now this one is shorter. This is just a short, flexible belt, Velcro attachment, etc. But some of the belts are quite a bit bigger in the back, and from there we can strap another powerlifting belt on top of it. Then we're going to get into our more traditional, rigid powerlifting type belts. We do not just powerlifting, going back to the beginning from our neoprene or thin flexible belts. We'll have everything from 4 millimeters, which is under a 1/4 inch, to 7s, to 10s, to 13s. It's about as thick as you're commonly going to find in the industry. 13 millimeters is about a 1/2 inch thick. We get into different apparatuses, the ratchet type belts. Our prong type belts. This is a bench press only belt for equipped. This mainly is designed to hold a bench press shirt into position, but you can see with this that we may not have much space for us to create rigidity and pressure into that belt. Might be a little bit better to hit an arch for some people in the bench press, but much, much smaller. Get into our lever type belts. And this is a newer addition to the industry. I'm sure most of you have probably seen this. Adjustable lever type belt, so it's not one size fits all. And then of course, last but not least, we have our buckle and prong type. Some of them even have 2 holes coming up and down, so we can adjust them in smaller increments. Very similar to what we see here. We strap this belt on. Our ability to not be stuck by holes a ½ inch apart. We can move this in smaller increments, which we may want to change for specific lifts. Now I've had Brandon here join me because we're going to talk about some common myths and just get them out of the way. Then we're going to talk about what a belt actually does. So 2 of the most common myths, well, they're kind of on either side of the spectrum. One is the belt has to be super tight to be effective. Hopefully, we're going to show you otherwise. If I have to get help from my friend here to crank this belt in, and I can't even breathe,
go now.
And I can't even breathe under the squat rack, it's not going to be efficient. You're relying on passive rigidity and structure from the belt, not some structure that you're making even tighter with your intra-abdominal pressure. The other side of that is the person who you might have seen in the gym before, not to make fun of them, but they got off the treadmill, they strapped their belt on, maybe got their weightlifting gloves on, and they're ready to go over and do some work. Right away, first set of bicep curls, bench press with the bar, whatever it is, they're suited up, belt, knee sleeves, wrist wraps, elbow wraps. It's just a little too much. You don't have to be strapped up right away from day one. What's one of the most common myths you hear, Brandon?
Well, I was going to say that second one is quite a bit less common for the populations that we see most often, but the first one, in relying on passive compression, does seem to be very common. People associate that feeling of tension and tightness and rigidness with stability, and it's really not the case. We are going to go a little bit further into breathing and bracing and how those things actually enhance the role of a belt, but one of the other ones that we hear quite often in seminars or working with athletes is that a belt will make your abs weaker, and that's really not the case, and it's not supported by research that's available. We've looked at different EMG levels of the abdominal muscles, of the lumbar spine, musculature, as well as the obliques, and we find that a belt doesn't actually make them contract harder, but it doesn't make them contract any less, and that's really, really important. What a belt actually does, though, is it doesn't make your abs weaker, but it enhances the amount of intra-abdominal pressure that you can generate. There's also papers on belted versus non-belted usage, and one of the things that I thought was really interesting when reviewing some of this is they found that lifters could often squat deeper with a belt on. Now, that doesn't really seem to make sense, but if you understand the role of intra-abdominal pressure and its stabilizing effect of the space between your pelvis and rib cage, it does start to make a little more sense, because people's depths typically are a result of a lack of stability. And if a belt can bring stability to that area by enhancing intra-abdominal pressure, it starts to make sense why, on average, lifters can actually squat deeper with the belt on more effectively.
We're going to produce more force, thus we're going to be able to handle heavier loads. Force production goes up because we're stabilizing this structure. Now, I ran through a bunch of different types of belts. Some of those might be a little better for me if I'm going to try to pick up a large stone off the ground, or an awkward heavy object in strongman, or receiving position for the snatch or the clean within weightlifting. Those are still doing the same thing. They may not be as tight and rigid in this. So from a powerlifting standpoint, or maximum force transfer, we could be training a baseball player for all that matters. We really want to optimize how much weight they're going to lift in squat or deadlift, for example. We probably want to put them into a tighter structure like this. Thicker belt, larger belt that covers as much surface area as possible. I like to think about the torso a lot of times as the rib cage, or sorry, as a can here, right? You can think a can, a pop can, a soda can, energy can, whatever it is. Think about this cylinder as our cylinder right here. Now, we've already talked, one of the flaws from structural rigidity within the body is, this is all soft. It allows us to bend and twist easily, where other spots in our upper back and rib cage we can't move so well. There's naturally more structure there. So imagine if this can was built more like my rib cage. All of the front part of this was soft, and there was extra rigidity along the backside where our spine and ribs would be. If I pressed down very, very hard on this can, it would crumple on the front side. So, same thing transfers over for us. If we think about this cylinder or can, as soon as we strap this belt on, we're adding some passive rigidity to the front side. When we learn how to use our belt properly, we can breathe and brace into that. I've now made this pressure even tighter to give me more of the structure that I'm missing on the front side that I have on the back of my rib cage.
Well, Kyle started to touch on a point, and that was, should athletes wear belts in the weight room? That's a really, I think there's a lot of people on both sides of that debate, and I don't think either side is necessarily wrong. I think the people who say that I want my athlete to train in the weight room like they would on the field, that's a valid argument. However, the things they're doing in the weight room are also not the things they're doing on the field, so that's kind of a counterpoint to that argument. Whereas the other side of it is athletes should wear belts from a protective mechanism as well as enhancing the amount of load that they're using in the weight room. That's also a very valid argument. So I don't think either of those are wrong. It really just depends on what side of the fence you straddle. And in my opinion, you should probably find a balance of both. A lot of unbelted training, such as your body weight exercises, of course, your dumbbell lunges, lower weight type exercises. And then when it's time to do harder axial based movements, such as your squats and your deadlifts, that's a really good opportunity to get a little bit more out of those movements and go ahead and put a belt on. So it's absolutely, it should not be an either this nor that type of an argument.
I think you hit it on the head really well. We talk about all the time in our Principles of Load Movement seminar, when we introduce axial load, axial force, that's probably a time where we should put it on, not necessarily for safety, but to maximize force output. How much weight can we lift on the bar? I don't know about you, the first time you put a belt on, as you were talking, I was thinking way back when, I originally just, doing some bodybuilding, some just gym stuff, remember thinking, if I can't pick it up without a belt, strap, or chalk, I don't deserve to have it in my hands. That was my mindset early on. And then I watched some stronger lifters than me, and they had belts on. And then they had knee wraps on. So what did I do? Well, I want to get stronger than I am as well, so let me try a belt. Well, force went up a little bit. I was able to move some more weight. We're not talking about knee wraps today, but then you can see where that went. Next thing you know, I saw, well, they can lift more weight with knee wraps. It's all equipment that allows our body to handle more load.
Yep. Now, as we've been talking about the different types of belts, some of the common myths and who uses belts, I think it'd be prudent for us to talk about how a belt actually works. Most people don't put a whole lot of thought into that, but I think the nuance of how a belt works will actually help you improve your technique as a whole. Now, a belt doesn't work, as we said, from passive compression and really tightening down and cinching down. A belt does work because it's rigid. That rigidity can be accomplished to a lesser degree just with your musculature, and that's what we refer to as bracing. Think about tightening your abs. That actual flexing of your muscles is bracing. Now, bracing is a reactive quality, and the other half of bracing, the thing that makes that spinal rigidity really, really complete, is intra-abdominal pressure, IAP. Intra-abdominal pressure now is actually going to be facilitated through respiration. It's going to be facilitated from your diaphragm, which is this big kind of cone-shaped muscle. The way that works is kind of like a piston. When you breathe in, intra-abdominal pressure is created because of a reduction in available space between pelvis and rib cage. As that diaphragm presses down, you're actually going to create an external stress across your muscles, and if you're wearing a belt, it's going to be against your belt. There's a reason that power lifters and different strength athletes use thicker, more rigid belts. That tighter outer sheath of musculature is going to enhance the amount of internal pressure that you generate. The reason a belt works is it actually enhances that outer layer of support. That outer canister becomes a little bit thicker. You can imagine with Kyle's can analogy, if you just had kind of a thin aluminum can, that's a whole lot different than like a few inches thick of steel, where that belt is actually that steel. It's going to allow you to press into it harder, which is going to create greater internal pressure. So it really doesn't have anything to do with your abs flexing harder or less hard. It has all to do with pressure. Now, if we look at this animation of how the ribs actually move, this is really important because when somebody uses a belt that is overly tight, they aren't actually going to breathe like this animation is showing. Notice how the ribs kind of contract and expand. If you have a belt that's too tight, that is likely to happen to an extent, but instead you're likely to have this higher elevated breathing, and instead of the rib cage expanding and contracting, you're actually going to have some elevation and tilting of the rib cage. That's a problem because when we look at these varying degrees of spinal change, you're going to see what we refer to as rib cage over pelvis. If we were to draw parallel lines from the bottom of the rib cage to the top of the pelvis, kind of like this, that's where our canister is going to be the strongest. If we have a spine that has a little bit too much of an arch, we have kind of a lordotic type posture or an anterior pelvic tilt, we don't have the same evenness of that canister, and we've changed the orientation of the rib cage to generate intra-abdominal pressure, and that's why we are proponents of keeping this stacked position. The stacked position is not only likely a little bit safer from a stress riser standpoint of the spine, but it's also a stronger position because you can generate greater intra-abdominal pressure. Similarly to the rounded back posture or that posterior pelvic tilt, because of the different ways that muscles are now pulling, we've changed the length-tension relationships of the muscles from the front of our body to the back of our body. We're not going to generate the same amount of IAP because of how the rib cage has changed its orientation with the pelvis. So a lot of people, when they have this anterior pelvic tilt and they have this kind of extended posture, they always think that their abs are weak. Well, that's usually not the case. The abs are still firing in this position, but they're holding an eccentric and isometric contraction. If you were to pull your ribs down, you would give your abs a greater opportunity to overcome forces, or at least maintain position. Muscles have an ideal range of pulling tension where they can be the most forceful, and we refer to that as balance of muscle length tension. If you take a muscle that's really long, let's say a stretched out bicep in this position, it's really hard for me to overcome this lever versus if that muscle was kind of in that position. That's how you can visualize the abdominal musculature and the posterior spine musculature when it comes to balancing that canister with our bracing. Now, if we look at a couple of these videos, you can see exactly practically what we're talking about in that kind of elevated and extended posture. Now, this is a technique that some people do pretty well. I tend to think that those individuals typically squat upright, very vertical, and the reason they can get away with that is there's not as much shear force happening at that lumbar spine, whereas if you had someone who is a little bit more bent over. Now, if you found success kind of breathing and practicing this way, we would encourage you to continue, but if you've had any hip issues, you feel like you lose your back position when you squat, we would highly encourage you to go to more of a diaphragmatic breathing technique or getting closer to this stacked parallel lines ribcage over pelvis position.
All right, hopefully that conversation from our head coach Brandon opened your eyes to the importance of proper rib cage position over pelvis, proper mechanics of the respiratory muscles from diaphragm to intercostals, the ribs, the function of those things. We don't want to just sound like a cop-out. Well, you know, people talk to us, or we talk to a lot of people, about breathing and bracing. People know us for that. We don't want to just say, well, your belt doesn't really matter and it all is a precursor to your breathing and bracing. Hopefully you understand why that statement could be true. We truly believe that if you understand how to use this better, whether you're a believer in always wearing a belt or never wearing a belt, this is going to function better. Now we strap this bad boy on and we're going to get that much more out of it. So if you're interested in finding out more about that or any of the stuff that we teach, that is some content directly from our Principles of Loaded Movement seminar, which we'll be carrying probably 10 more this year throughout the U.S. That being said, let's stay on the topic of belts. We've talked a lot about them. We've showed some examples. Now, let's look at some live examples so we can help teach you how to use your belt better. In this example here, you're going to see a belt that is way too tight. What happens, I have to breathe up into my chest here because it's strapped on so tight that the only breath I can get is coming up into my rib cage here. We'll let that play a couple more times. Again, this belt is my actual belt, so it's not going to. But if I strap that in so tight, I actually had to be pulled into there, that I'm only going to be able to expand here because I can't breathe out into this spot anymore. Awesome. Now let's look at, probably not as common, but for some beginners, they're going to wear their belt too loose. That is also a problem because if it's literally falling off of me, it's not going to do anything. This, I can't say, is a bigger problem than a belt that is too tight, because they both cause issues that can lead to injuries. But this one's a false sense of security. There's just nothing going on. I can breathe into it well, but if I don't maintain maximum pressurization right here, you can see it's literally going to fall off me because the belt is simply too tight. So if the belt, too loose. If the belt is too tight when it's strapped on, I'm going to be led up into this position, which might cause some problems. But at least in that case, there's some passive resistance from the belt. We know that's not optimal. In the loose example, there's just nothing there other than it feels like I have something. Both fairly dangerous. Now let's look at a good belt. It should be tight enough where I can fully fill out and brace into that belt, as you see here. And breathing can be maintained in the right position of my torso. One of our checks for this is, you can do it yourself, or you can have your friend or training partner check you. I should be able to slip a hand in there, right? There's Coach Joe slipping a hand in, and I ask him to take his hand back, and he can't have his hand back until I let go. I actually had to back off this belt here live a little bit to do so, right? I can easily slip in, fingers even, but when braced hard and I finish into that brace, it just doesn't come out. I wanted to show Big Strong Joe, Coach Joe, I pinched his fingers and smashed them, and he couldn't get his hand back. If the belt was too tight, he would never be able to get his hand in there in the first place. If the belt was too loose, no matter what I did, the biggest brace, the biggest breath into that quadrant wouldn't be able to hold him in. Now that we've spent some time showing you how to properly put on the belt, let's set it aside for a second, and let's talk about a little bit more of the function. So a quick background story. I remember when I used to be one of the ones that cranked the belt on too tight. I would grab on the side of the squat rack and I would lean into it and have a friend help me pop the prong in the hole. I was a multiply lifter, and I'd waddle up to the platform and go hit my lift. I was relying all on that maximum compression. I didn't understand how to breathe and brace. By the time I started hanging out with Kabuki, they were putting out more information that helped me a lot. I understood. But it was hard for me to breathe and brace into a big belt. And not the size of the belt, I mean a looser belt, to clarify. So at first I would find the belt would be strapped super tight, and I would move it a notch, and I just couldn't feel like I got full. Now I can move, as you'll see in this video, I can expand pretty large. Same thing with Chris Duffin. You look at the expansion, it moves quite a bit. The reason I bring that up is because you might find that your belt will actually get looser over time because you can still expand and fill that out. Let's look at the squat that's playing behind me and what it looks like without the belt. Right? They're sucked in. There's my brace. I breathe into that brace and I descend into the squat. You can see there's a lot of movement here in the torso. And I don't mean shifting back and forth. I try not to suck in too much, but there's a lot of expansion here before descending into the squat. So if you're not that good and you need some help to get better at your belt, what drills does Kabuki Strength recommend? Well, let's check out some of our favorites. Right here, this is pretty self-explanatory. It's just a dead bug. If we pause the video here, one thing we would actually do, this is at our Principles of Loaded Movement seminar, we put a strap right here underneath the low back. And something simple, just like some nylon backpack strap. I thought about this after I filmed it, but it's just an example of our static position. So if I didn't have a training partner that could challenge me by pulling that strap out, I would just hold on to it myself and give it a little tug. That just keeps me honest, so the space between my back and the mat isn't arched and losing the pressure, just like we would in the back of our belt. So as we move through here, this is just holding static position, really learning how to expand into that belt, imagining the belt's there, expanding into the floor. There's not a lot of movement here. It's just a static dead bug. It teaches me to expand the torso, all of these respiratory muscles, all of my abdomen, right? Create that large 360 or omnidirectional expansion. Maintain that while breathing in and out. Next, we introduce movement because in the squat or deadlift, we can't just stand there. We have to actually move. Same thing, this could be tested by a partner with pulling on a strap from underneath the back. Introduction of movement. Maintaining IAP by bracing, holding that breath. If a belt was there, we would have even more intra-abdominal pressure. Now we're going to take the next part, add load. You can see here I'm holding a boomstick in my hand. 22 pounds. That's decent for this exercise, for what we're doing here. Arms going one direction, legs going the other direction. This can be done a lot of different ways. Same side, opposite arm, opposite leg. The load overhead really adds some complexity into this movement. The movement of the legs is also going to challenge that position Brandon talked about, rib cage over pelvis, because if with the movement I get pulled open, there's no way, like that can analogy, this is going to maintain pressure. Whether I'm wearing a belt or not, I will lose intra-abdominal pressure as soon as this cylinder opens up. All right, let's get off the ground and let's look at some band drills. These are absolutely some of our favorite. This is just me in what we call like the Sphinx band position. I'm just sitting, hands and knees on the floor, band is wrapped around that low back, and you can see my goal is to expand right into that quadrant of the low back where we find it's difficult. You can reach back if you're flexible enough and grab yourself here. We just find this band drill to be so much better. It's really cool to feel the band actually stretch and expand as well. Cool. So this is specific for the low back or the back of your belt. A lot of people also fault in the front and the side. So let's check out some other options to help cue that. Right here you can see I'm breathing, setting a brace, breathing into that brace. Look at the expansion of where we can get. That's just a mechanical brace there. First it was breathing. So this is me just filling the same muscles, right? Or using the same muscles to fill that quadrant full of air. And then a hard muscular brace. If I was properly breathing into my belt, or setting IAP I should say, I would set that harder muscular brace first and then breathe into that brace with about the remaining 15 to 20% of air to create maximum intra-abdominal pressure. So you can see this is a cueing drill, but it can be done for breathing or bracing, and held the brace while breathing in and out to ensure that I can maintain my brace for like a long duration, multiple reps sets in the squat. Cool, let's check out our next favorite, the side. Let's address some obliques. A lot of times we'll find a difference between left and right sides. So here you go. Set it up, get some pressure, and we're literally trying to breathe laterally, as you can see here. I'm not trying to shift my hips to cheat and move into the band. I'm actually trying to get the band to stretch only from my breathing and bracing, really focusing on the obliques or the side of my waist as opposed to the front. All right, let's look at one of our other favorites that we cue and we use. It's just a seated self-oblique cue. I'm going to sit on the bench, sit on a chair before I'm squatting, deadlifting, whatever, in my movement prep, and I'm just going to work. Same thing, breathing in and out into those obliques. I can check a couple other spots here if I'd like to. Again, if I'm bendy enough, I can reach around the back and grab that. Here you see me checking spots a little more anterior, not so lateral here. So this can be used to prime breathing, prime bracing, or to finish both of those off together to create that IAP. Remember, our golden rule we like to teach at the Principles of Loaded Movement seminars is we can't be passively reliant on air, which means that big air cue, that's not nearly going to be as strong as 80% structure from the muscular brace, 20% air, finishes off, makes it even tighter. This drill, you can work both of those skills. And last but not least, if I have my coach with me, if I'm coaching athletes, or I have a training partner that wants to cue that back, the same place we saw on the band, but a little more specific, getting those thumbs in there right into that low back. Coach Brandon Morgan here, pressing into my low back, My goal is to breathe into that quadrant. Hopefully you can see his thumb. Yep, there it is, moving in and out from my low back. That is the goal right here, what we're doing. We want the thumb to come in and out of the back, breathing and bracing. So those drills between static dead bug with movement, loaded dead bug, band drills if you're weak in one area, or if you're a coach and you're doing hands-on cueing, will really help you start to build that expansion for your breathing, bracing to set up quality IAP so you get more out of your lifting belt. Well, that about has it for the day. Hopefully, you'll believe us that you should train more frequently with a belt than without. But if not, you at least learn some things about your breathing, bracing mechanics, rib cage over pelvis position, different types of belts, and you can make a more informed decision for yourself when you should and should not be wearing a belt. So when we were talking about creating this webinar, we were thinking, as the coaching staff, would we ever program without a belt? And head coach Brandon asked me the question. I answered and said, well, yeah. And he said, why? And I thought about it. I said, well, because I said so, because I want to, but why? And that was a hard question for me to answer. And if I came up with a more detailed opinion on why I might be able to add a couple snippets in there. But to cover probably the top 3 reasons why we wouldn't, because most of us coaches at Kabuki agree when we're talking, right, axial load, so force on the spine pressing down, our bigger main movements, we're going to ask our athletes to put a belt on. A couple reasons why we wouldn't, just a personal choice. If I wanted to program something without a belt because I wanted to, it's a personal choice. If I had an athlete who just didn't want to wear a belt, that's a personal choice. We might get better results wearing it, but personal reasons, maybe we're going to program it, maybe they're not going to wear one. The next would be if our athletes are not good at showing everything we've showed today, and they're new and they're really not skilled at breathing and bracing well. That might be a place for a softer belt, a neoprene belt, a breath belt, something like that. Definitely more tactile cueing, the drills we showed you with the bands, with fingers, etc. Because if they're not good at it yet and they strap a belt on but they don't know how to use it, the risk of injury probably doesn't jump up greatly, but they have self-confidence or exaggerated self-confidence because they feel this tighter thing around their waist. They're not good at the mechanics of their spine yet, so they throw more weight on the bar. That could kind of be a recipe for disaster. The real only place that we would program it, Brandon hit it early in this talk, with athletes, maybe field sport athletes. So we have somebody, a coach that might be saying, well, you know, my athletes can't wear it on the football field, or, you know, I train professional boxers and they don't ever get to wear one there. I agree. But squatting and deadlifting is not playing football. Squatting and deadlifting is not boxing, right? So we can see where that makes sense, but it also doesn't make sense. Because for me, if I'm working with a beginner athlete all the way to a professional level athlete, when they're in the weight room, I want them as safe as possible, and I want them to get as strong or in as good a shape as absolute possible. Some of that, when we're talking axial movements, axial loaded movements, that's going to be with a belt on. So again, that force production can go up. We can lift more weight and stay safer while we're doing it. So some general recommendations then for programming. Coach Kyle, I get asked all the time, Coach Kyle, when do you put a belt on? How soon should I put a belt on? I have an easy general answer. Now this is pretty general. I say it at the Principles of Loaded Movement seminar all the time. About 50% of your load for that day, not 50% of your max. So if I can deadlift 700 pounds and I'm going to do a workout of 500 pounds for reps, for say, in the deadlift, that doesn't mean I strap on my belt at 350. That definitely doesn't mean I strap on my belt at 450, or I go up 1 plate, 2 plate, 3 plate, 4 plates, put it on at 4.5 plates, put it on one time, or put it right on at 5 plates and go to work. I could do that. The reason I recommend 50% of the day's working load, so yes, that means if I'm only deadlifting 500 for reps that day, at 250, I suggest that belt's going on. Now, that doesn't mean you have to make these crazy jumps to match that 50%. That probably means for me, I'm putting it on at 2 plates. So I might only have 1 or 2 warm-up sets just priming my deadlift, just opening the hips up with a plate, maybe 2 plates. I'll strap it on, hit 2 again, 3, 4, 450, 500, and go to work. The reason for that is because you need more time in the belt, especially if you're newer to it or you're not good at breathing and bracing. A higher level lifter could probably get away with weighting more, but why am I going to pre-fatigue myself a little bit, making my body work a little bit harder? Let's put the equipment on. Again, I don't suggest walking into the gym, strapping that weight belt on before we do our movement prep, before we even grab the bar out of the rack. That's a little excessive. So that's where I came up with the magic 50% rule of that day's working load. So if we're always wearing a belt then, in our main movements at 50%, when do we get beltless work? That's the next question I get all the time. Well, a lot. Because I promise you, walking around the gym, practicing this breathing and bracing, maybe while I'm doing tricep extensions, might sound crazy to you. There's a lot of time I can have that muscular under tension, right? Time under tension is huge for strength, endurance, etc., etc. So think about it like instead of me just relaxing, walking around the gym, doing chest supported rows, maybe a chest bench. Chest press machine, pushing, right? I can really work some intra-abdominal pressure there and fine tune that. That's like me doing a plank throughout the majority of my workout. So there's plenty of time where you can train your core or train your abs, even with what we're showing you here, without constantly wearing a belt. That, just like being barefoot, is where we suggest you get a bunch of your extra work in to make you better and stronger. So under that axial load, wear a belt. When you move on to your accessories or some of your warm-ups, up to 50%, wear a belt. Other than that, choose the right belt for you. Let's get it on at the appropriate times, and let's make your squats and deadlifts better.